Thank you for joining us. And again, as Jimmy mentioned, this is the week where we kind of mark 1 year. It was 1 year ago that we had our first service with an empty sanctuary, and myself and Kristen Regal and Dee Cooper, the executive presbyter, sat right up here and preached our Lenten sermon for that Sunday. Here we are. 1 year later, we've learned a lot. Hopefully, we've grown a lot. Hopefully, we will not go back to normal. We will go back to better. This last week, I was very, very fortunate and thankful to be able to be a part of Second's monthly book club. It's a group of bibliophiles that get together every month. David Warm leads them for excellent, rich discussion on really challenging, creative, thought-provoking books. This week, or this last week, for the month, they read through Braiding Sweetgrass. It is the book that I have recommended that we read. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is herself a Potawatomi member of the Potawatomi Nation, and the subtitle is Indigenous Women, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. It was also good for me. It was a great discussion, and I've got a new headset that I can't get to fit on my head. So not only do we have the wonderful challenges of technology, we've got just a clingy earpiece that won't seem to stay on my really big ears. So forgive me for that. Not only was the discussion excellent, but it also helped me. A couple of the questions that people had as we were working through it were, why exactly are we studying Native American spirituality? Why are we talking about indigenous wisdom in church for 6 weeks during Lent? It was an excellent question. And the folks that were part of this book study said, once I read this book, I understood it because it's a deeply, deeply spiritual perspective on indigenous practices and wisdom. But it helped me to kind of think through, as pastor here, the fact that a lot of you don't understand why it is or how it is that we land on certain topics or themes when it comes to the sermons, to say the theme that we'll preach through at a time like Lent or for the summer season. And it's not just the themes that we talk about through sermons on Sunday mornings. These themes that we come up with are spread through and influence the books that Geneva reads to our children. It influences the conversations that are had in our C3 small groups, the events that we put on, the special educational opportunities, the guest speakers that we have. We try to do this in a way so that the theme for the season is spread throughout all of our ministry areas. That's something that we've been trying to do for some time. And so this month's theme, this 6-week theme on rootedness, and I'm asked Jimmy to pull up the picture there. That's the theme for this Lenten season, what biblical cultures and indigenous wisdom teach us about the power of deep connections and the inadequacies of individualism. This idea for this series came from a discussion among Second's seasonal leadership team. Now, the idea of the seasonal leadership team, that idea of a team came out of Second's strategic vision from 2 years ago called The Great Report. If you recall, if you were here, part of us at that point, we spent about 9 months having conversations and trying to determine what our core values were again, and reaffirm where it was we felt like God was calling us to narrow in and to be focused in the years ahead. And one of the things that we learned, and if you haven't had a chance to read The Great Report and that visionary document, we'll put a link to that in the chat. We'd love for you to take a look at that again. We have continued to try to follow what we felt like God was speaking to us and the vision and the direction that we received from that process. But one of the main focuses of that report was that as brilliant and as amazing and as welcoming as this congregation is here at Second Presbyterian Church, we have got to work even harder at making sure that church, that our leadership structures, that our ministries, all of them are more accessible to all different kinds of people, not just more accessible to the people that we've been in the past or the people that we know, but accessible to everybody so that we can connect and reach out with the good news of the gospel to all. We've understood that we need to do a better job of creating better space, and so that has affected how our building looks and what we've done to widen hallways and to provide for better access into this space. We realize that we've got to do a better job of making ways for people to connect, for people who can't be here. In fact, about 6 or 9 months before the pandemic shut us down, Second had already started a Zoom account because we knew that there were some people that couldn't be in person for meetings or for small groups, and so we started Zoom. We didn't really know what we were doing at that point. There was only a few of us, and now look where we are today. Some of the ideas and the inclinations and the ways that we began to lean into opening ways for us to connect have really served us well as we moved into this pandemic time. We built a front porch where we had a parking lot so we could connect better with our community, and we spent the summer having concerts out there, socially distanced in the outdoors. Shifts and changes like that, though, learning to speak new languages and to learn new technologies, to open our doors wider and find new ways of doing things, it is uncomfortable. It's not easy. But the thing that I think we have learned through this pandemic is that we are called as Christians not to be comfortable, but to make sure we are connecting outwardly with our God, connecting with each other. And yes, that comfort then comes as residual from that. But as long as we are outwardly focused, connecting with each other and making sure that we are staying connected with God, creation, and each other, that comfort will come. And so when it comes to what it is that we will study or focus on for a season like Lent, we also determined that rather than just have a scholar pastor go back into his or her study and come up with what it is that we will think about or what that person will preach on for the next 6 or 8 weeks, and rather than just turning to something like the lectionary or the Book of Common Worship, which are great aids, but were also written by people that look like me, scholars and pastors, not a super diverse group. Rather than continue to turn to those wells to draw our wisdom and our ideas from and what we will be talking about and thinking about as a community, we determined that we needed to open up that as well to a group of people from various backgrounds and committees. And so that was how the seasonal leadership team was formed. The seasonal leadership team that you saw an image of earlier, the people who gather together every 6 months and they take a look back at what we have done and what we've talked about, the themes that we have explored, and we look at it and encourage the things that have gone well and constructively kind of criticize the things we could do better. And then we spend a day looking forward and trying to discern together where it is that we feel like the Spirit of God is calling us to lean into, where God might be calling us to become a little more uncomfortable. And so that is where we came up with this series of Rooted. It was in November and December of last year that the seasonal leadership team gathered together. And I have to be honest with you, when we were together for those 2 meetings on Zoom, we weren't in a great place. If you think about November and early December, there was a lot of sadness. There was concern for our country. Not only was the pandemic peaking, and we didn't know exactly when we would be able to come out of our cocoons, but also you had more and more people in our country following the lead of our former president saying that the elections were rigged and that Joe Biden was not actually the president-elect. The challenges and the rifts and the tension in our country were palpable, and it felt like we were at a breaking point. And so as we gathered together and thought about the next 6 months, one of the things that we thought about was, well, maybe one of the things that God is teaching us through this pandemic year, starting a year ago with Breonna Taylor's death and the lockdown, and then the death of George Floyd, and everything that we have rolled through and unearthed and gotten uncomfortable with in this past year, the inequities, the challenges. Maybe one of the things that God is teaching us through this year is that the way that we in America, and what I mean by that is especially those of us in leadership in America, the way that we even view the world, the way that we understand and frame the problems and the issues of the day, maybe that, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, that we call that in philosophical terms epistemology, the basic ways that we even know the world. Maybe that American way needs to be re-examined. This idea that we have in America that we kind of grow up with and we just understand as being real, that hyper-individualism is something that we take for granted. Free markets, viewing resources as limited, understanding competition as being vital and important. Maybe that basic American epistemology, the way that we frame and understand the world, is something that we need to take a look at. And maybe God is exposing to us. And then, of course, on top of that, we tend to surround ourselves with people who think like us and look like us, and that just compounds the problem. So we sat in those 2 Zoom meetings and said, so what do we do? If this is what God is kind of helping us to feel uncomfortable about, if this is what's been exposed, what do we do about it? And so we talked for some time, we prayed, and our answer, we thought at the time, was that it would be good for us at Second Pres to expose ourselves to wisdom from different worldviews. We have, throughout 2020, been confronted by remembering that there are so many people in our country that don't share the worldview of privileged people like me. And so we kind of dug into that a little bit more and tried to think about who we could look through, whose lenses we could look through that would help us to maybe see differently than our typical Western American epistemology. And we thought perhaps we don't need to look any further than the very people who called this land theirs before we did, who shaped the worldview of America before it was called America. And as we began to dig into that idea, the perspectives of indigenous people and Native American spirituality, I got to tell you, folks, that's not something that I've really done before. I've heard about it and kind of on a tertiary level. I've read some things, but those books are not on my shelf. That perspective, thinking about that as a possible way to challenge or to learn from the inequities that we have uncovered in our world this year, that's not something that I would have thought of. That's not something I would have done. I don't think that way theologically. But a number of people on that seasonal leadership team, as we spent a couple of days in that room, spoke up and shared their ideas, books they'd been reading, things that they had heard, and they persuaded the rest of us that the Spirit was nudging us in that direction. And so if you have found yourself in this Lenten season kind of wondering, why exactly are we talking about native spirituality, and why are we talking about indigenous wisdom in church in Lent? You're not alone. I felt the same way too. But I tell you what, friends, I thank God for people who don't think like me. I thank God for people who have different books on their shelves and different experiences, who have spent time thinking about other worldviews and ways of understanding problems that I haven't. I'm so glad that I got shoved out of my intellectual and theological comfort zone, and therefore over the last number of weeks have been exposed to new ways of understanding and experiencing my God's deep-rooted wisdom and love for me and for creation and for all of God's children. Because here's the thing, friends. We so desperately want to, in our epistemologies, create these lanes, this understanding of how it is that we connect with whatever it is, our family, the news, the world, our God. And so we can start to think that the only way that we can really understand our God or experience the wisdom of God is if we do things the way that we've done them before, right? And we can start to think that there is one story that contains all of the wisdom, one religion that contains all of the love, one history or one tradition that we have to go back to understand God's will and God's way. Friends, that's not our tradition, actually. Our tradition, our belief is that our God is the God of heaven and earth. Our God is the God of all of creation. Our God is the God who's been working and is at work in every lane. In fact, has a way of demolishing lanes because our God is the God of all of it. Our God is, as we say, sovereign, omnipresent, omnipotent. Our God is in all and through all, and our scripture says that as much. And so wherever it is that we can find deep wisdom that resonates with our understanding of who God is in Jesus Christ, wherever we find that, even if we find that in the traditions of people that we sadly and sinfully have called savages in the past, then friends, that is the wisdom of God. And we need to put aside our old ways of thinking and open our minds and our hearts to experience what it is that the God of creation can teach us from people who are different than we are. One of the more wonderful stories, I think, of Scripture that I think has also been misunderstood through at least the lens that I was taught to look at it in. One of the most wonderful stories in our Hebrew scripture that helps us to understand our kind of personal proclivity, our cultural proclivity for building walls around our worldviews and atrophying into these silos and echo chambers, and not listening to or not understanding or appreciating wisdom that comes from different languages. That story is the story of the Tower of Babel. It's found in Genesis chapter 11. Now, in this series, one of the things that I've loved about this studying indigenous wisdom is that it's helped me to realize that so much of the wisdom that we lean upon, the tradition we lean upon as Christians, comes from our Hebrew brothers and sisters in the Older Testament, and some of the epic stories and the ways that they were formed as itinerant and indigenous people themselves. The theology that we espouse, the spirituality that we practice, is not American. It's not Western. It came from a nomadic and farming people who lived in the Middle East, who were very much tied to the land and their surroundings. And so we've been able to recognize that the indigenous spirituality of today and the Hebrew spirituality of our Christian roots have much in common. And so I've been able to understand some of the readings in Genesis and Exodus in a different way through the lens of the wisdom of indigenous spirituality. And so in Genesis chapter 11, we have the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, just to put this in context, this is, of course, we've had the creation, the two different stories of creation, and then we've had Adam and Eve sent out of the garden. Then they had their children Cain and Abel, and there was a bunch of disruption and problems. And finally, God says, all right, we're going to start over, and there's a massive flood. And then after that flood, you've got the ark that lands on Mount Ararat, and you've got Noah and his family and all of the animals, and they come out into the world again, and the humans begin to propagate, begin to grow again, until it says in Genesis 10 and 11 that they were big enough, there were enough humans to form a city. And so the story of Babel tells about that first city. And if you were like me, you grew up learning this story of the Tower of Babel with certain understandings of what it was about. The story was to teach us about human pride, and the desire for humans to want to be better and greater and to even compete with heaven. That's the way I understood this story. The way we learn these stories is through the Bible stories that we hear when we're little kids, a lot of us. And so I want us just to hear this story once again through the lens of a children's Bible story and see if it resonates with you. We're going to show you just a quick video, the story of the Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel. Many, many people now live in the world, but they came from the same region and spoke the same words. The people thought they were smarter than God. They were so proud, and they had no shame. They wanted glory, and they wanted fame. But they were afraid that they would be scattered. They didn't love God, so they took up the matter.
Let's make ourselves famous,
they would holler.
We have learned to bake bricks and stack them level. We can mortar these bricks to make a large tower. We can build this tower to reach the heavens.
The city of Babylonia was on a large plain. Flat land is a good place to build a large tower. While the people were busy with their building campaign, God watched them during their working hours. God saw that the people didn't love him. Together they could get this bad job done. God put words in their mouths that they couldn't understand. Their words sounded silly and confused everyone. No longer proud, the people could not get this bad job done. God kept everyone safe, and the evil plan was beaten. They couldn't finish building the brick tower to heaven, and many of the people scattered to other regions.
And so, the story of the Tower of Babel is that the people were proud, that they didn't love God. They wanted to build a tower that reached to heaven so they could be as great as God. And so God confused their language and stopped their bad job, and they were scattered to keep from competing with God. Interesting, because the fact is the text says nothing about pride. says nothing about competition, doesn't say that the people didn't love God, doesn't even say that the people were building a tower to reach into the heavens. It's interesting what our perspective can bring to a text. So what I'd like us to do is just read this text once again together, and I'm going to ask Jimmy to put up the slide. Genesis 11. All people on the earth had one language and the same words. When they traveled east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks, make them hard." They used bricks for stones and asphalt for mortar. They said, "Come, let's build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky." You see, that word sky can be interpreted as sky, which it typically is, or some chose to interpret it as heaven. "Let's make a name for ourselves so that we won't be dispersed all over the earth." We don't want to be dispersed. And then the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the humans built. And the Lord said, "There is now one people, and they all have one language. This is what they have begun to do, and now all that they plan to do will be possible for them. Come, let's go down and mix up their language so they can't understand each other's language." And then the Lord dispersed them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. Friends, that is the Bible. That is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, if you look at this text, if you read this through the lens of a culture like ours that views leaders suspiciously and that views leaders as people as being insecure, subjects who tend to be proud and competitive, then you can draw certain conclusions from the story. But if we actually read this text in Genesis 11 in its literary context, through the lens of the indigenous people, the Hebrew people, and the lessons that they had been learning from God this whole time, you see something entirely different. In both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, God says to creation, says to the men and women, you need to go into all of the earth. And then when we get to Noah and his family finally making it through the flood, God says, go out into all of the earth. In Genesis 12, the chapter right after this one, that's the first story that we hear of Abram and Sarah. Abram and Sarah, who lived in what is today Iraq, and God spoke to them and said, "I want to make you into a great nation, and through you I will bless you, and you will be a blessing to all peoples. You will be a blessing to all nations." And they get up and they move. You see, God's inclination from the very beginning, and even in the story of the Tower of Babel, is to send people out and away, to disperse to all nations. God, in God's wisdom, desires diversity for people to live and to be into different places. God desires us not to surround each other and to surround each other with those who are just like us. Our tendency, you see, is for comfort. God's tendency is for connection. For us to connect with the land, for us to connect with creation, for us to connect with others who are different than we are. God desires to bless all nations, not form and bless one nation. Our tendency, God reminds us in this Babel story, and maybe the lesson that we have learned this year once again, our tendency is to store up resources, to circle the wagons, to seek sameness, to sink deep roots, and to build strong walls. There is actually nothing wrong with building together. It's nothing wrong with sinking deep roots as long as we understand and we remind ourselves again and again that the land that we are sinking those roots into is not my land. And it's not your land. It's God's land. It's creation. As long as we understand that and the rootedness, the connection that we have because of creation, we will be okay. There's nothing wrong with our American kind of story of being individuals, of being the person that you were created to be, of living into your best self. There's nothing wrong with being a strong individual, but the thing that we need to be aware of is individualism. There are big differences between the two. We can, you see, appreciate our individuality and the individual gifts that we have and the way that we flourish and we shine, say, above ground. But at the whole time, we need to also understand and be aware of the fact that the roots that we sink into the ground connect us with everybody, connect us with all of creation, that we are dependent upon each other in a way that sometimes our minds can't fathom. What affects one affects all. We are deeply interrooted and connected in God's creation, God's family, God's will. We can appreciate individuality, but when we begin to surround ourselves with people who are like us and who espouse individualism, we can get into trouble. Because we can start to think that we are smarter, that our way is the only way, that our gifts, our understanding of the world and how we frame it is the smart way. But friends, when we surround ourselves with people who think just like us, who have the same gifts and inclinations as us, it depletes our roots from the diverse nourishment of different and diverse forms of life, God's nourishment to all of us through creation. The wisdom of individuality and of collaborative blessing at the same time, learning from and leaning on the very different strengths and beauty of others. This is a lesson that is found time and again in many of the stories from our indigenous brothers and sisters. And so I want to close with one of those stories, one that has stuck with me. It's called the story of the three sisters. The three sisters is the way that Native American people talk about three beans. The corn bean, and there is the bean, and there is the squash. These are the three sisters. They're very different from each other, but the way that the Native American people, the story that I've heard it, is that these three sisters, as different as they are from each other, that they need to be planted right next to each other. And so the indigenous wisdom in planting was not to plant the same crop, the exact same crop, in rows for efficiency. No, it was to plant these three sisters next to each other. And so you had corn, which would grow up first and would grow up strong and tall and had blonde hair and was rugged and was the first one through the earth. And then you had the bean that would grow up, that would sprout about 3 weeks later than the corn stalk. And guess what the bean did? It was not tall and proud. It was straggly and it was wiry. And it was industrious, and it grabbed a hold of that corn stalk and it made its way up the way that the corn had established. And as it did, it began to bear fruit. And then a couple of weeks after that, you had the squash, which came through, and it didn't go up, and it wasn't wiry in the same way. It went out. That third sister wanted to kind of get away from home. And so she begins to spread out, and as she does, she grows big, beautiful leaves, and she puts in roots wherever she goes. And those big, beautiful leaves keep the moisture in the ground so that the roots of all three plants can continue to draw upon the moisture as it comes, and it doesn't evaporate right away. And the nitrogen that they need from the soil, all of them, rather than deplete it, you see the bean is one of those legumes that can draw nitrogen actually out of the air and push it back into the ground. And so these three very different and diverse sisters that could be competitors instead bless each other, work with each other, share their beautiful individuality in a way that is mutually strengthening. The wisdom of the three sisters. A wisdom that we can and should learn from and be blessed by. Because friends, if we look around and all we see are other wiry people just like us, or tall, blonde people just like us, it might be comforting, but it's probably not very nourishing. If we find ourselves a little uncomfortable, if we find ourselves scratched a bit by the leaves of the squash plant that is actually scratchy to keep the little moles and predators away, if we find other people's needs of being kind of grabby and holding us, or the shade of others affecting us, friends, perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps that's a sign that we've been forced beyond our walls and into a world where God can use our individual gifts and strengths and leanings to bless others, and for other people's strange and individual ways and perspectives to disrupt and feed and bless our souls. Friends, that's a lesson that we have learned in this last year. May the Spirit of the living God, the God of creation, continue to infuse that wisdom, that confusion, that connection into our very souls in the year ahead, for the good of all of us and of creation. May it be so.